The strongest alpha in the world once ignored everyone around him. But after I returned to life, he became the one person I could not escape. Ethan Brooks never expected a second chance. The last thing he remembered from his previous life was the cold silence of an empty hospital room, the unfinished notes on his desk, and the painful realization that he had spent years proving his worth to people who had already decided he was insignificant. As a beta doctor, Ethan had always been placed at the bottom of the ABO hierarchy. He had no powerful scent, no influential family, and no special status that made others look twice. To most people, he was simply the quiet doctor who worked harder than everyone else and asked for nothing in return. But Ethan knew something they did not. Being overlooked had become his greatest advantage. When he opened his eyes again, the familiar ceiling of his small apartment greeted him. The morning sunlight spilled across the room, the same golden light he remembered from 5 years earlier. His phone displayed a date he thought he would never see again. He was back, 5 years in the past, before the mistakes, before the regrets, before he lost everything he cared about. Ethan sat up slowly, his heart racing as countless memories returned. The choices he made, the people he trusted, the future he could now change. This time, he promised himself he would stop chasing approval from a world that never valued him. He would become the doctor he always wanted to be. He would live for himself. At least, that was the plan. Until the day Alexander Hayes walked into his hospital. The name alone could silence an entire room. Alexander was the most admired alpha in the country, the heir to Hayes Medical Group, and a man known for his perfect control and impossible standards. Doctors and executives competed for his attention, hoping to gain even a small piece of his recognition. But when Ethan met him, he felt something different. He did not see a powerful alpha. He saw a tired man hiding behind a flawless reputation. During a routine medical consultation, Ethan spoke to Alexander like any other patient. No nervous compliments. No attempts to impress him. No fear. Just honesty. Alexander noticed immediately. "You are not afraid of me," Alexander said quietly. Ethan looked up from his tablet. "Should I be?" For the first time in years, Alexander had no answer. Everyone treated him like someone untouchable, someone impossible to understand. But this beta doctor looked at him like he was simply human. And somehow, that was the one thing Alexander could not ignore. Ethan believed returning to the past meant avoiding his old mistakes. He never expected that his second life would place him directly in the path of the one person who could completely change his future. The weakest beta doctor had returned with a new purpose. But the strongest alpha had already decided he was not going to let Ethan disappear again. The next morning, Ethan Brooks arrived at Hayes Medical Center earlier than usual. The familiar halls looked exactly the way he remembered, from the polished floors that reflected the bright ceiling lights to the quiet hum of doctors moving between appointments. 5 years ago, he had walked through these same doors hoping to prove himself. This time, he walked in knowing exactly who he was. Ethan adjusted the strap of his bag and reminded himself not to repeat the past. He did not need to impress anyone. He did not need to chase recognition. He only needed to do his job. But staying unnoticed became impossible when Alexander Hayes started appearing everywhere. At first, Ethan thought it was a coincidence. Alexander had a busy schedule, countless meetings, and an entire company depending on him. There was no reason for the most powerful alpha in the medical world to remember a single beta doctor. Yet every time Ethan entered a room, Alexander seemed to notice. It was not dramatic. It was not obvious. It was simply a quiet awareness that made Ethan wonder why. During a medical review, Ethan carefully explained Alexander's health reports and pointed out a small detail that several specialists had overlooked. "You caught that?" Alexander asked, looking over the information on the screen. Ethan nodded. "It was in the numbers. You just have to look closely." Alexander leaned back, studying him with a thoughtful expression. Most people tried to impress him with complicated explanations and confident speeches. Ethan did the opposite. He made everything simple, clear, honest. That honesty was becoming difficult for Alexander to ignore. Later that afternoon, Ethan walked into the staff lounge and immediately noticed the change in atmosphere. Conversations became quieter. People looked toward the entrance. Alexander had arrived. Several employees straightened their posture, suddenly aware that the most influential alpha in the building was standing nearby. Ethan expected the usual tension. Instead, Alexander walked directly toward him. You left your notes in the consultation room, Alexander said, handing him a folder. Ethan blinked. You brought them here yourself? I was nearby. The answer was simple, but Ethan knew Alexander had no reason to do that. He accepted the folder and smiled politely. Thank you. That small smile caught Alexander off guard. It was not admiration. It was not an attempt to gain favor. It was just genuine appreciation. For someone who had spent years surrounded by people wanting something from him, that simple reaction felt strangely rare. Ethan did not realize it yet, but the balance between them had already begun to change. The world saw Alexander Hayes as the strongest alpha, a person who controlled every situation. But Ethan was the first person who made him feel like control was not always necessary. Meanwhile, Ethan focused on rebuilding the life he had lost. He reviewed old cases, improved his medical skills, and quietly prepared for the challenges he knew were coming. He believed his second chance was about avoiding the mistakes of the past. He did not know that some things were meant to happen twice. And this time, Alexander Hayes was no longer just a person from his memories. He was becoming the unexpected part of Ethan's new future. The days that followed became a quiet battle between Ethan Brooks and his own memories. Every hallway in Hayes Medical Center carried pieces of the past he wanted to avoid. A conversation near the elevators. A familiar name on a patient file. A decision that once led him toward failure. But this time, Ethan refused to walk the same path. He focused on his patients, his research, and the small victories that reminded him why he became a doctor in the first place. Yet there was one unexpected change he could not ignore. Alexander Hayes kept finding reasons to be near him. It was never dramatic. Alexander did not make grand announcements or demand attention. Instead, he appeared with questions about medical reports, asked for Ethan's opinion during meetings, and listened carefully when Ethan spoke. For someone known for making decisions quickly, Alexander seemed unusually patient around him. Ethan noticed it, but he tried not to overthink it. In his previous life, getting close to powerful people had only brought disappointment. He had learned the hard way that admiration could disappear the moment someone stopped being useful. But Alexander was different. One afternoon, Ethan was reviewing a complicated case when Alexander entered the conference room. The room was filled with experienced doctors, each one offering suggestions. Ethan quietly listened until he noticed a detail everyone else had missed. The symptoms do not match the original assumption, Ethan said. The room became silent. One of the senior doctors looked surprised. You think the diagnosis is wrong? Ethan nodded calmly. I think we need to consider another possibility before making a decision. Alexander watched him carefully. In another life, Ethan remembered staying silent during moments like this. He remembered allowing louder voices to take control because he was afraid of being dismissed. But this time, he trusted his own knowledge. After the meeting ended, Alexander stopped him in the hallway. You have changed, Alexander said. Ethan looked at him. Changed. Before, you seemed like someone waiting for permission to speak. Alexander paused. Now you speak like you already know your value. The words surprised Ethan more than he expected. He had spent so much time trying to convince others that he mattered that he almost forgot he needed to believe it himself. Maybe I finally learned, Ethan replied. Alexander looked away for a moment, as if considering something he did not usually allow himself to think about. Most people around me want something, Alexander said quietly. A position, a connection, a favor. His eyes returned to Ethan. You are the only person who treats me like I am just another person. Ethan did not know how to respond. He had never expected honesty to affect someone like Alexander Hayes. The strongest alpha in the building looked almost uncertain, almost human. Then something unexpected happened. During a routine examination review, Alexander noticed that Ethan had skipped lunch again. Without saying much, he placed a meal container on Ethan's desk. You forget to take care of yourself, Alexander said. Ethan stared at the food, then at him. Are you always this concerned about your doctors? Alexander answered immediately. No. That simple word carried more meaning than Ethan wanted to admit. For the first time since returning to the past, Ethan felt something he thought he had lost forever. Not fear, not regret, hope, but somewhere deep inside, he knew this new connection would challenge everything he believed about his second chance. The days after Alexander Hayes brought lunch to Ethan Brooks felt different, even though neither of them spoke about it. Their routine had changed in small ways. Alexander still carried the same calm expression, still walked through Hayes Medical Center with the confidence of someone who was used to being listened to, but now he stopped by Ethan's office more often. Ethan tried to convince himself it was nothing. A simple friendship. A professional connection. Nothing more. But every time Alexander asked for his opinion, Ethan noticed something unusual. The most powerful alpha in the building actually listened. He did not interrupt. He did not dismiss him. He waited. That alone was something Ethan had never experienced before. One afternoon, Ethan was organizing patient files when a message appeared on his computer. It was an invitation to join a private medical research project. In his previous life, this opportunity had been the beginning of a difficult chapter. The project looked promising, but hidden problems eventually damaged his reputation and ended his career. Ethan stared at the screen, remembering every detail. For a moment, the past felt close enough to touch. Then he closed the message. Not this time. He would not make the same choice, just because the future was familiar. You look like you are fighting a battle in your head. Alexander's voice pulled him back. Ethan turned and saw him standing near the doorway. I am just thinking, Ethan replied. Alexander stepped inside. About what? Ethan hesitated. He had never been comfortable sharing his worries, especially with someone like Alexander. But something about Alexander made silence feel unnecessary. About whether knowing the future is actually an advantage, Ethan said. Alexander looked curious. You speak as if you have already seen it. Ethan smiled slightly. Maybe I have just learned from my mistakes. Alexander studied him carefully. He did not push for answers. Instead, he said, everyone deserves the chance to become better than they were yesterday. Those words stayed with Ethan long after Alexander left. Later that week, Ethan faced another reminder of the world he had returned to. Some doctors still underestimated him. They saw a beta and assumed he lacked ambition. They saw his quiet personality and mistook it for weakness. But Ethan no longer carried the same insecurity. He calmly explained his research, supported his conclusions, and earned respect through his actions. Alexander watched from a distance, and for the first time, he understood something important. Ethan was not trying to prove he was better than anyone else. He simply refused to let others decide his value. That was what made him different. That evening, Alexander found Ethan leaving the hospital after a long shift. You work too much, Alexander said. Ethan smiled. You say that like you do not. A rare expression appeared on Alexander's face. Almost a smile. Maybe I learned it from you. Ethan laughed softly, surprised by the comment. The moment was simple, but it changed something between them. Alexander Hayes, the man everyone saw as unreachable, was slowly becoming someone Ethan could understand. And Ethan, the beta who once believed he had nothing special to offer, was beginning to realize that his second chance was not only about changing his own life. It was also about meeting the one person who would change his forever. The morning after Ethan Brooks and Alexander Hayes shared their quiet conversation outside the hospital, Ethan noticed something unusual. The atmosphere around Hayes Medical Center had shifted. People were still busy, still moving between appointments and meetings, but whispers followed Alexander more often than before. The difference was that now those whispers included Ethan's name. Ethan tried to ignore it. He had returned to this life to change his own future, not to become the center of attention. But he quickly realized that standing beside Alexander Hayes came with its own challenges. During a research meeting, Ethan entered the conference room and immediately recognized several faces from his previous life. These were the same people who had doubted him years ago, the same people who had once made him question whether he belonged in the medical field. For a moment, old memories returned. The feeling of being overlooked, the frustration of watching others receive credit for ideas he created, the loneliness of working twice as hard just to be considered equal. But Ethan took a slow breath and reminded himself that this was not the same day. He was not the same person. When the discussion began, several senior doctors presented their plans for a new medical project. Ethan listened carefully until he noticed a missing piece in their approach. There is another factor we should consider, Ethan said calmly. The room became quiet. One doctor looked surprised. You believe the current plan is incomplete? Ethan nodded. I believe it needs more information before we move forward. His voice was steady. His explanation was clear. He did not try to challenge anyone. He simply shared what he knew. From across the room, Alexander watched with quiet interest. He remembered the Ethan he first met, the doctor who was talented but hesitant. This Ethan was different. He carried himself with confidence, but he had not lost his kindness. After the meeting, Alexander approached him. You knew they would disagree with you, Alexander said. Ethan looked at him. Yes. And you spoke anyway. Ethan smiled slightly. I spent too long being afraid of what people thought. Alexander was silent for a moment. Then he said, that was a mistake they made, not yours. The words stayed with Ethan. He had spent so many years believing he needed to prove his worth that he never considered the possibility that he was already enough. Later that evening, Ethan received an unexpected message about the medical research project he remembered from his previous life. The same project that once caused problems was beginning again. He stared at the information on his screen, knowing this was the moment where his old choices would return. In his past life, he accepted without hesitation. This time, he would investigate everything first. Before he could close the message, another notification appeared. It was from Alexander. If you need help, ask. Ethan looked at the simple sentence and smiled. Alexander Hayes was known as someone who stood above everyone else. Yet somehow, he was the person offering Ethan support without asking for anything in return. Ethan had changed his own future, but he was beginning to understand that some connections were impossible to avoid. Some people appeared in your life not because of fate alone, but because they were exactly where you needed them to be. The research project that Ethan Brooks remembered from his previous life was no longer just a distant memory. It was happening again, right in front of him. The same documents, the same names, the same opportunity that once changed the direction of his career. Ethan sat quietly in his office, looking through every detail with careful attention. 5 years ago, he had trusted the people involved because he believed hard work was enough to protect him. Now he knew better. Talent mattered, but understanding people mattered too. Before making any decision, Ethan wanted answers. The following morning, Ethan arrived at the research department and found Alexander Hayes already there. That alone surprised him. Alexander rarely visited this part of the hospital unless there was an important reason. You came here early, Ethan said. Alexander looked at the files on the table. So did you. Ethan smiled slightly. I have a habit of arriving early. I noticed, Alexander replied. You also have a habit of forgetting to leave on time. Ethan looked away, realizing Alexander had been paying more attention than he expected. It was strange. Alexander remembered small details. He noticed when Ethan skipped meals. He noticed when Ethan stayed late. He noticed things most people ignored. As they reviewed the research information together, Ethan explained his concerns. He did not accuse anyone. He simply pointed out areas that needed more investigation. Alexander listened carefully. You are very cautious, Alexander said. Ethan nodded. I learned that being careful is sometimes the only way to protect your future. Alexander studied him for a moment. There was something behind those words. Something Ethan was not saying. You talk like someone who has already lost something important, Alexander said. Ethan became quiet. For a second, the room felt smaller. Alexander had noticed the one thing Ethan tried hardest to hide. The weight of memories that did not belong to this timeline. Maybe I just learned from experience, Ethan answered softly. Alexander did not question him further. Instead, he looked at the documents again. Then we will make sure history does not repeat itself. Those words affected Ethan more than he expected. In his previous life, he had faced every challenge alone. He had carried every problem by himself because he believed asking for help was a weakness. But Alexander made it feel different. Not like rescue, like partnership. Later that week, Ethan attended another meeting about the research project. This time, he was prepared. He presented his concerns clearly and supported every point with evidence. Some people disagreed, but Ethan remained calm. He no longer needed everyone's approval. He only needed to be honest about what he knew. When the meeting ended, Alexander approached him. You handled that well. Ethan smiled. I was just doing my job. Alexander shook his head. No, you were trusting yourself. Ethan looked at him, surprised by how accurately Alexander understood him. For years, Ethan had been called weak because he was a beta. People had mistaken kindness for vulnerability and quietness for a lack of ambition. But Alexander saw something different. He saw determination. He saw intelligence. He saw someone who had survived more than anyone knew. And Ethan began to realize something important. Changing the past was not only about avoiding pain. Sometimes, it was about allowing the right people to finally see you. The days after the research meeting changed something between Ethan Brooks and Alexander Hayes. It was not a dramatic transformation. There was no sudden announcement, no moment where the entire hospital noticed. Instead, it happened through small details. Alexander began trusting Ethan's judgment more often. Ethan began allowing himself to accept support without immediately questioning the reason behind it. For someone who had spent his previous life believing he had to stand alone, this new reality felt unfamiliar, almost impossible. One evening, Ethan stayed late at Hayes Medical Center to finish reviewing patient information. The quiet halls reminded him of the past, but this time the memories did not control him. He was no longer the doctor who waited for others to decide his value. He was someone who had another chance to choose differently. As he prepared to leave, he noticed Alexander standing near the entrance. "You are still here," Alexander said. Ethan smiled. "So are you." Alexander looked at the files in Ethan's hands. "You always work until everything is perfect." Ethan looked down. "I just want to make sure I do things correctly." Alexander was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You carry too much responsibility for someone who thinks he is ordinary." Ethan looked at him, surprised. Those words felt strangely familiar. In his previous life, people had constantly reminded him that he was only a beta. They made him believe his efforts would never be enough compared to those with higher status. But Alexander never looked at him that way. He saw Ethan as a person first, not a category, not a position, not a label. The next week, an unexpected situation brought them even closer. A major medical conference was being held at Hayes Medical Center, and Ethan was asked to present his recent findings. Normally, he would have felt nervous. In his previous life, standing in front of important people had always made him doubt himself. But this time, he walked onto the stage with calm confidence. He explained his research clearly, answered questions thoughtfully, and showed everyone the knowledge he had built through years of dedication. When the presentation ended, the room responded with genuine respect. Ethan stepped away feeling something he had forgotten existed. Pride. Not because others approved of him, but because he finally approved of himself. After the event, Alexander found him outside the conference room. "You did well," Alexander said. Ethan smiled. "Thank you." Alexander hesitated before continuing. "I meant what I said before. You are not ordinary." Ethan looked at him. "Why do you care so much?" The question was simple, but it carried everything Ethan had been wondering. Alexander did not answer immediately. For a man who always seemed certain, this was one of the rare moments where he searched for the right words. "Because you remind me of something I forgot," Alexander finally said. "That strength is not always about power." Ethan felt his expression soften. The strongest alpha in the hospital was telling him that his greatest quality was something beyond status, something beyond the rules of the world they lived in. But while Ethan was beginning to understand Alexander's feelings, he did not notice that someone else had been watching his rise. The people who once ignored him were starting to pay attention. The beta they underestimated was no longer invisible. And soon, the secrets of Ethan's past would begin to return, bringing questions that even his second chance could not avoid. The days after the medical conference brought a new kind of attention to Ethan Brooks. He was no longer just the quiet beta doctor working behind the scenes. People at Hayes Medical Center began recognizing his name, asking for his opinion, and acknowledging the dedication he had always carried. Ethan appreciated the change, but he also knew how quickly admiration could disappear. His previous life had taught him that success was not only about ability. It was also about trust, timing, and knowing who truly stood beside you. That was why he remained careful. He did not want to lose himself again while trying to create a better future. Alexander Hayes noticed the difference. He noticed everything about Ethan. The way Ethan paused before answering difficult questions. The way he treated every patient with patience. The way he stayed kind even when others were not. Alexander had spent years surrounded by people who wanted his approval because of his position, but Ethan never looked at him as the most powerful alpha in the room. He simply saw Alexander. One evening, after another long day at the hospital, Alexander found Ethan reviewing old medical records in his office. "You are searching for something," Alexander said. Ethan looked up, surprised. "How did you know?" Alexander glanced at the files. "Because you only look that focused when something matters to you." Ethan smiled softly. He was still amazed by how easily Alexander understood him. "I am trying to understand why certain events happened differently this time." Alexander became quiet. Different this time? Ethan realized his mistake and quickly looked back at the documents. But Alexander did not question him. Instead, he sat across from him and said, "Whatever you are carrying, you do not have to carry it alone." Those words reached deeper than Ethan expected. In his previous life, he had wished someone would say that. He had spent years solving problems by himself, believing that needing support meant he was weak. But Alexander showed him another perspective. Accepting help did not erase his strength. It proved he trusted someone enough to share the weight. A few days later, Ethan discovered a hidden connection between the current research project and the events that had shaped his previous life. The information was incomplete, but it confirmed one thing. His return was not simply an opportunity to avoid mistakes. There was a reason he had been given another chance. When Ethan shared his concerns with Alexander, he expected doubt. Instead, Alexander listened carefully. "Then we find the truth together," Alexander said. Ethan looked at him. "You believe me?" Alexander answered without hesitation. "I believe you." For Ethan, those 3 words meant more than he could explain. The person everyone considered impossible to reach had chosen to stand beside him. Meanwhile, Alexander was beginning to understand his own feelings. He had spent his entire life believing control was the only way to succeed. But Ethan had changed that belief. Ethan did not challenge him with power. He changed him with honesty, compassion, and the simple reminder that even the strongest person could want someone who understood them. As the two of them continued searching for answers, Ethan realized something important. His second chance had started as a way to rewrite his own story. But somewhere along the way, it had become something much more. It had become the chance to build a future he never believed was possible. The morning after Ethan Brooks and Alexander Hayes decided to search for the truth together, everything felt strangely calm. For the first time since returning to the past, Ethan did not feel like he was fighting against an invisible clock. He was no longer running from memories or trying to prevent every possible mistake. He had someone standing beside him, someone who believed him without needing proof. At Hayes Medical Center, the investigation into the research project continued quietly. Ethan carefully reviewed every document, comparing the information he remembered from his previous life with the reality in front of him. Some details were different. Some events had changed completely. It proved that the future was not fixed. Every choice mattered. Every person mattered. One afternoon, Ethan discovered a missing connection in the research records. A decision that once damaged his career had been changed because he chose to speak up earlier. A mistake that once seemed unavoidable had disappeared. Ethan stared at the information on his screen and realized something important. His second chance was not just allowing him to avoid pain. It was allowing him to create something new. When Alexander entered the office, he immediately noticed Ethan's expression. "You found something," Alexander said. Ethan nodded. "The future changed." Alexander looked at him carefully. "Because of you." Ethan smiled faintly. "Because of the choices I made." Alexander shook his head. "That is exactly what I mean." Those words stayed with Ethan. For years, he had believed his life was controlled by things he could not change. His status as a beta, other people's opinions, the expectations placed on him. But now he understood that strength was not always about having the highest position. Sometimes strength was choosing to believe in yourself when no one else did. As weeks passed, Ethan and Alexander became an unexpected team. The hospital staff noticed how naturally they worked together. Alexander, who was known for his distance and seriousness, became more open when Ethan was around. Ethan, who once avoided attention, became more confident without losing his kindness. They balanced each other in a way neither of them expected. One evening, they stood outside the hospital after a long day. The city lights reflected across the streets, and for a moment, everything felt peaceful. "Do you ever wonder what your life would look like if you made different choices?" Alexander asked. Ethan looked toward the skyline. "Every day." Alexander was quiet. And now, Ethan thought about everything he had gained. The opportunity to become a better doctor. The chance to understand himself. The person standing beside him. "Now I think every choice brought me here." Alexander looked at him, and a small smile appeared. It was rare, but Ethan had learned to recognize it. The strongest alpha in the world was not someone who needed to control everything. He was someone who finally found a person he could trust. Ethan had returned to a life he thought he lost. He expected to rewrite his mistakes and walk a different path alone. Instead, He found a future filled with unexpected connections, new possibilities, and someone who saw his value from the beginning. The beta who was once overlooked had finally discovered that his greatest strength was never something others could measure. It was the heart, courage, and determination he carried all along.